Welcome to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Charles Good. My guest for this episode is Dr. Julia Sloan, the author of the definitive book on strategic thinking, Learning to Think Strategically, that just released its 5th edition. In today's episode, it's all about strategic thinking, what it truly means, and more importantly, how to become a better strategic thinker. We'll break down the key steps to move beyond simple planning, dive into why some of the best strategies might come from unexpected non-work experiences, and reveal how tools like critical inquiry can transform your approach to solving complex problems. So if you're ready to up your strategic game, then this episode is for you. I hope you enjoy. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we engage with esteemed thought leaders and explore research-backed strategies and techniques that empower leaders at every level to achieve meaningful results that drive lasting change. Welcome to the program, Julia.
Thank you so much, Charles. I'm always so delighted to talk with IMS audiences.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. My first question really is around the book. What's changed in the latest, the 5th edition of the book?
Well, I'm very excited. The 5th edition is out. It's on bookshelves, and I'm just so happy that it's out there. So what's changed? There have been a lot of updated citations, updated examples, some new information. Probably the biggest addition has been Chapter 12, which is a chapter on the role and the relationship of AI and strategic thinking. And several new examples that I think are really interesting, and I think are very interesting, or it seems like they've been very interesting to readers so far on the entire sweep through of strategic thinking.
I know that many leaders struggle to differentiate between strategic thinking and strategic planning. How would you define that distinction, and why is it essential for leaders to embrace both?
I think it's really critical for leaders to differentiate between strategic planning and strategic thinking. What I use it's in the book, and what I use for workshops is a triangle model where I break strategy down into 3 different parts based on the underlying thinking that's required of each part. And I just think this is such a fundamental, foundational thing that leaders across industry sectors really need. So strategic thinking basically focuses on the problem. Do we have the real problem? Do we have the right problem? And the kind of thinking that supports this is divergent thinking, also intuition. It's an informal process. Emotion has a huge part to play. Imagination. It's a very messy process. It's a highly iterative process, a zigzaggy back and forth process. And the end result of it is actually a process of what I call, kind of poking holes in a current strategy, or poking holes in the thought process of whoever that leader is. If we compare that to strategic planning is completely different. Strategic planning fulfills a purpose of solving the problem. So strategic thinking is focused on the problem itself. Do we have the real problem? And strategic planning focuses on the solution. So it uses convergent thinking, it uses linear thinking, analytical, rational, logical thinking, reductionist thinking, and eventually the outcome of a strategic plan is the strategic plan itself, a product. And then implementation, of course, is getting out and just doing whatever you've planned to do. So I think the types of thinking that support each one of these is absolutely essential for leaders, from CEOs right down to new hires right out of university or even high school interns. I think it's critical that people know this.
Well, that's a great distinction. And we mentioned this in our last interview, and listeners can go to that to kind of see an unpacking of it in more depth and detail. But love how you differentiate it, because, right, strategic thinking is more creative, visionary, focused on exploration, adaptability, future possibilities. Strategic planning, practical, structured, focused on execution and those measurable results. And many people, like you said, get that wrong and don't really understand the tools needed for each as a result. So I
Well,
love your model that you have to get people to learn strategic thinking. And it's a three-stage model. And the first stage of it is called the preparation phase. And I'll unpack it a little bit, but then hopefully you can provide some more details around it and perhaps some tools to really get people comfortable with that stage. So the preparation stage helps individuals set a foundation for strategic thinking by combining the cognitive, the data gathering and analysis, and the emotional components together. The cognitive component, I think everyone's more familiar with because it involves collecting data, examining the relevant information. It's what you learn in school. The affective
exactly.
component, talk to us more about that, about the emotional readiness, the passion, and the conviction that's needed.
I think people often forget about that affective, emotional component, and it drives the cognitive piece. And interestingly, as you were reading and or not reading, but you were mentioning some of the emotional components to it, fear is actually the greatest motivator in terms of this whole preparation stage. And I think people are sometimes surprised about that. Although once you mention it, people think, yeah, that's me. That's what happens to me too. People are fearful around strategy, largely because people often don't know what it is. They don't know what's required. All they know is it's this great big thing. And it's the number one responsibility of a leader is to set strategic direction. That's why people follow leaders is to set some direction. So there's a lot of conflation, there's a lot of confusion, there's a lot of things that get mixed up. But one of the things that tends to remain constant is this emotional piece of fear that becomes an impetus. And I think that a lot of times we're taught that fear is a bad thing. But in the case of strategic thinking, the fear is actually can be twisted a little bit to be a very positive thing, a very strong motivator because it tests our conviction. It tests our commitment to wanting to poke holes in a problem. It's something that gives us courage to ask the deep dive and the really tough questions that are really required of strategic thinking. So I think one of the things that I work with a lot with clients is reframing their fear and reframing that to something that feels much more like courage.
This reminds me of an example of Apple. During the development of the iPhone, Steve Jobs combined intense data analysis with a strong emotional conviction that mobile devices should be intuitive and user centered. His
Mm,
belief and passion in changing the user experience drove the strategy from Apple during that time, helping it align with the efforts of the team. So successful companies do this all the time, but it's really that emotional
yeah.
drive that sustains the long-term strategic efforts, correct?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And that's the forgotten part is we think it's all mental. It's not. Emotion is such an important part. And I'm glad you brought up this three-phase model because once people know about those three phases, I find people relax. People relax because those emotions are so strong and we try and get rid of them and they just keep bouncing back. So when we can look at that and say, within this first phase, as we're doing all the things we're taught, which are good, to gather data, gather information, analyze, look at reports, in the background, behind the curtains, is usually an emotion. Very often, that emotion is fear. And that's a good thing because, like I said, it can be turned around to say, this is a test of my courage. How strongly do I feel about this? And am I really willing to put myself out there and have people kind of poke holes in my thinking? Because that's what's necessary and very often avoided.
Let's move to the next phase is the experience phase or stage. It's where individuals actively engage with real world situations using both current experiences and prior successful experiences as a reference point. So, talk to us more about that and the importance of this phase.
This is a fun phase. This this is a fun phase because it's so messy. It's really sticky and it's really messy, but we have to go through it. And again, once we know about it and we find ourselves in this state of a little bit of turmoil and maybe a little bit of disorientation and discomfort, we're fine. It's just when we don't know about it, we think we've made a detour and we're stuck in the ditch. So what the second phase often looks like is that people feel confused. They often feel frustrated, very excited as well. So there's a lot of competing emotion in this phase. And to get people out of this tangled web of confusion and excitement and frustration that's all kind of combined, what people tend to do is they look backwards. They look to their past experience and they search for a success experience. Now, what's interesting about this is that the success experiences that successful strategists tend to draw upon are most often completely unrelated to business, just totally unrelated to business. And this is important and it's fun to do. So a lot of times what I find is people will draw from, say, they've had maybe they grew up on a farm and they're very comfortable and very familiar with looking at the seasons, of looking at life cycles of animals, life cycles of birth to death, life cycles of raising a herd or raising, animals. But they often will look to something like that and they'll look to the weather and they'll remember how familiar and how comfortable they were with uncertainty, unpredictability, things they can't control. And then they say, "You know what? I've been there, done that." Okay. And then they tend to see the challenge in terms of their previous life experience. Another example, so farming and gardening are two things that come up all the time in people's past success experiences. Another thing that comes up a lot, an awfully lot, is people will say, "Oh, this challenge at work, this strategic challenge at work that's so confusing and so frustrating and so full of paradox, it reminds me a lot of when I play in the orchestra, or maybe they lead an orchestra, or maybe they used to sing in a choir or something, or maybe they paint, or maybe they used to do pottery." But the arts are something that people draw upon very heavily as past success experiences that then transfer into their current business situation. This requires a very high level of cognition because we're doing parallel thinking. We're also doing this batting back and forth, really rapid transfer of context in one situation to context in another. That's tough. Where our mind is also looking at what's same and what's different, but it's just doing this very, very rapidly. So it's a great launching pad into metaphoric thinking, which again, we know requires very high levels of cognition, is one of the most advanced tools of cognition that we're currently aware of. So it's a fun thing to do with people. They don't need to know all the details I explained, but it's just a fun thing because successful strategists do this anyhow. They say, what's this like in my past and why is this so familiar to me? And suddenly the strategic challenge that they're looking at, there are all kinds of possibilities that get coughed up because of their previous experience.
This is so critical to me because it's one of the surprising parts of the book when I first read it several years ago, that these non-work experiences from different fields can significantly enhance strategic thinking by broadening your perspectives, fostering creativity, providing these fresh insights to problem solving. And there's famous examples that really play this out as well. I mean, Howard Schultz, he drew inspiration from Italian coffee culture when he was in Milan, where cafes served as social hubs. Recognizing this pattern, he applied it to Starbucks, transforming it into a kind of a third place outside the home and work where people could gather. His experience from the Italian cafes led him to see Starbucks not just as a coffee shop, but as a strategic hub of the community and a way to connect with others. These examples abound, but you're right. All the great strategic thinkers pull in insights from other fields in order to draw those deep strategic insights to help them solve problems within their business or area of specialty.
Yeah, and it's just a little nugget that I hope listeners will pass on to other people that they're working with in their teams, in their workplaces, because it has application. It's a human thing. And so it has application across cultures, it has application, across different industry sectors, and it's just a fun way of looking at something that seems overwhelming and really challenging. So it's a fun little nugget to take away and to play with.
The reevaluation stage. where you involve critical reflection on the outcomes of the strategic decisions and actions, helping individuals either validate or challenge their prior beliefs and assumptions by examining what worked, what didn't, and why leaders need to gain a deeper understanding of the rationale, perhaps, behind their choices.
Yeah, this final phase, the second phase, that's a really messy phase, really ends with the importance of critical reflection, that we need to be able to engage in that critical reflection in order to make new meaning out of a past experience and new light on a new situation. But this third phase is also really about the ability to use critical inquiry, getting people to ask you really good questions that kind of deep dive your own assumptions and belief systems. It's also about our own ability to critically reflect on a situation. And that's something that takes time. So this third phase is where it kind of gets stretched out a little bit, where people are trying to tie the knots and really trying to make new meaning of their circumstance and their situation. So this is where this whole set of critical reflective processes of critical inquiry, critical dialogue, and critical reflection really make or break a strategist's ability to really set a new direction, particularly with something that is innovative.
There are several examples of this. Amazon, after launching Amazon Prime, the company continuously reevaluated customer feedback and adapted its logistics strategy, leading to additional features like same-day delivery. Procter and Gamble's done this, which with great success, where all of its product innovation strategy comes from reevaluating customer preferences and market trends and questioning their assumptions so that their ongoing lineup, their product lineup gets refined, enabling to maintain relevance across very diverse consumer segment. So it's such a critical part of this overall approach and strategy. And I would argue that this is the one phase that people don't, and especially leaders, don't do enough of. They're in
Oh,
execute mode
absolutely.
only, and they don't spend the time to reflect.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think this is the ability, we talk a lot about adaptability, agility. Those have become buzzwords, but they're almost meaningless without the ability to critically reflect. And to critically reflect takes time. And there's a part of it that you really can't do by yourself because we're so blinded to our own assumptions and beliefs that the only way that they can come to light for us is with other people, particularly people who may see the world very differently. Really have an opportunity to poke holes in our thinking and ask really good, critical questions, and that takes time. And again, the trade-off tends to be time versus depth of thought. And so I think, adaptability is all about getting into a habit of working out almost a routine of inviting people who see things very differently than you to really take a jab at your way of thinking.
Let's move into some of the tools and the insights that you have in your book that we didn't get a chance to cover during our last interview. And the first one I'd love to talk about is the and polarity thinking. It's a crucial tool for leaders, helping them to manage complex opposing values without forcing an either or choice. But it requires leaders to view both sides of a polarity as interdependent and essential, balancing them dynamically based on the current needs. It's tough to do, but it's a great tool if you can use it effectively.
This is I'm so glad you brought this up, Charles. This and polarity is actually one of my pet projects, something I absolutely love because it's a pillar of strategic thinking, and it's something that is almost always disregarded or ignored or kind of made invisible. And we can't have an innovative strategy without recognizing and acknowledging and polarity. So what it basically is recognizing that you're in a really frustrating, that you're in a pickle, that you're in a really frustrating situation that seems overwhelming and it seems impossible. And the reason it seems impossible is because you have these two and polarities. And there's been a lot that's been written on and slash or thinking. That's not what this is. This is and thinking, where you have two things that work in opposition to each other, not just two things you need to do. So it's two things that really cannot come together. And it's the tension of these two things, okay? It's the tension that creates this gap. This gap is where innovative thought can emerge. And I absolutely love, love, love working on this when I teach workshops and when I do lectures because it's just such a huge turnaround moment. I've written down a couple of really common and polarities that every strategist is facing right now. It seems whether it's public sector or government or private sector. One of these is how do we, on the one hand, how do we preserve our traditions and modernize? You can feel that tension where almost every because we're in such a state of disruption on so many levels, this applies to almost everybody. Where on the one hand, we're fearful. We think, we've built the reputation of our organization on these traditions. We don't want to just like throw the baby out with the bathwater. On the other hand, we know we have to modernize. AI is just an integral part of every single business today. And there's fear on both sides. So it's really this gap that gives the opportunity for innovative thought. This is the most fun thing. It's very difficult to work with, but it's also the most fun thing to work with. A second example that we're all facing is how do we optimize AI capability and optimize human capability? These are two and polarities that, we can feel that tension. And one of the exciting things about working, I think, in business right now is that nobody has the right answer. There's so much experimentation in terms of how are we going to fill this gap? What are we going to do with these two opposing forces? So it's exciting to see what people are coming up with. Some things work, some things don't work, but there's that opportunity and excitement of innovation. So the third example that again we're all facing, everybody is facing, is how do we build for the future and deliver today? And this, again, everybody can feel that tension anywhere in the world, any industry, because we're all living that of things. Change is moving so rapidly. Disruption is so much a part of our every breath. At the same time, we have to deliver on results today. At the same time, we have to be able to plan for the future. So this whole idea of the tension of staying with the tension of an and polarity it's a lot of fun.
Great tool. I've seen it work, but it's very difficult to get it. Just to give some insight into how I've kind of used it, and you
Yeah.
can kind of let me know if this is a good framework, Julia. Is start by identifying the key values in a situation, the two sides that may be pulling in opposite directions. List the
Yes.
pros and the cons of each side, map out their benefits and downsides, and then identify where the organization currently leans within that polarity and where it should ideally be. The goal here is really to kind of find that balanced point that supports both values, but also remembering you can adjust these dynamically over time. This isn't static. So leaders may need to shift the balance between the polarities based on external conditions, organizational needs, or strategic goals. Make sure you engage stakeholders and emphasize communication. Different stakeholders may value one side of the polarity more than others, so it's engaging them to help create a shared understanding. And then I think perhaps most importantly and perhaps most difficultly is reframe conflicts as interdependent needs, right? When teams disagree, use polarity thinking to reframe those conflicts, perhaps as opportunities to leverage both perspectives.
That's a really great suggestion and a great tip. I also like what you said at the very beginning of this comment about getting people involved and coming up with what are your values on each issue, and really bringing in people who may have perspectives that are very different, because setting up an innovative strategy is high risk for everybody. And we all know that when a strategy is not successful, the blame game starts. So a lot of times people will exclude themselves from a strategy conversation, particularly when they feel that tension of the and polarity.
And there's a few famous examples that I kind of came up with as well to see if they work on one Tesla. Tesla balances sustainability, commitment to eco-friendly energy with profitability, ensuring it's a viable, growing business. You see Google balancing freedom for its employees, encouraging creativity with structure, ensuring the projects align with the company's goals. And Walmart, perhaps is the most obvious one with these polarities. They try to balance low-cost operations, keeping prices affordable, with also hopefully helping and enhancing the customer experience, improving store layouts and technology. So a lot of corporations are dealing with this. From the examples that you gave and I gave, it's something that's critical as part of any strategy, and you have to have this in your toolkit if you're going to be an effective strategic thinker.
Oh, absolutely. And when you think about, again, the role, there's so much leadership training. And I think when we go back to the number one responsibility for a leader is to set the direction. And the first thing, you notice is the fear that grips people who are in charge of setting, especially an innovative strategy. And so once people know about and polarity, I think it really helps them in terms of coughing up the courage to take on something that's really challenging, difficult, and has potentially, you know, amazing possibilities.
Another insight that you provide in your book that I think is critical for any strategic thinker is being able to shatter frames for strategic insight. Perhaps you can go into that in more detail to say what is a frame and
Yeah.
how do we get so embedded within certain frames that can really inhibit our strategic insight.
This is something I was thinking of when we were just talking about the polarity of how important it is to be able to identify and articulate and kind of keep track of the frames that we use. And frames give us a perspective on something. There are many, many, many frames that we all bring with us. For example, we may have functional frames. Maybe you always see things through or see problems through a finance frame or a legal frame or a technology frame or a marketing frame. Those are functional frames that we bring with us to almost every strategy meeting. But in addition to those, there are often other frames that we need to be upfront about. Political frames. Around the world, people tend to have preferences in terms of political frames. You need to be aware of that because they can really influence economic frames, and economic frames can influence political frames. Religious frames are another thing that often infiltrate a business, even though we try to keep things separate. Our religious frames, if there are some, can influence, the strategic direction that we tend to prefer. Social frames, social groups. Age it often comes with the frames. Anything that sets the context is important in terms of strategy. This whole idea of shifting and shattering and reframing it's a critical skill that good strategists need to have because we don't want a frame that's so rigid that it can never adapt to the environment or can never adapt to a new context. And the way that we check ourselves with that is, again, by inviting other people, especially outside people, to poke holes and to shift and shatter our frames and see how sturdy are they, where's their leeway.
Because
Also,
most of the time we're unfamiliar, right? We're unconscious of the frames that we have. So we need other people to really point those out because in some cases we just aren't able to see how we're looking at a situation and how that's affecting our mindset, our beliefs, and our perspectives.
that's right, because I mean, that's one of the human attributes is we're able to make frames. We're able to bring frames. We're able to create frames to situations because making a frame and creating a frame is what gives meaning to any particular situation. But as a result of that, we often develop blind spots and we often develop same frame thinking, especially if we've worked with groups or worked within the same group for more than 18 months, 18-ish months. we tend to develop groupthink, which is so efficient. It's a great thing. It's fun to be part of a group that thinks the same way you think. But when it comes to creating especially an innovative strategy, that can be very detrimental to an ability to shift or shatter a frame. Another thing that's very important to help shift and shatter frames is exposure. Just exposure to new and different ways of doing things and thinking things. And this is one of the things I mention in the book is the value of travel and the value of exposure to new things. Just simply observing new things, you get ideas and you pull ideas together can be very helpful for shifting and shattering frames. Dabbling in any form of art, whether it's painting or whether it's music or whether it's photography or dance, it doesn't really matter. Because when you're in the arts, you're constantly required to shift and shatter frames. That's what makes one production so interesting or new or disturbing. It's also what gives way to a new interpretation of a musical composition. So engaging yourself in any form of the arts is really, really great for shifting and shattering frames.
And it's really critical for strategic thinking because it breaks those habitual ways of perceiving and interpreting information, allowing leaders to challenge assumptions, explore new possibilities, and really ultimately innovate and have that innovative strategy. And there's some big companies that have done this well. Netflix shattering the DVD rental frame. Netflix started as a DVD rental by mail service. However, the internet became faster. They shattered their original model about DVD rentals and adopted a new frame of streaming entertainment. I've
That's
also
right.
seen this like in IKEA, shattering the premium furniture frame. Traditional furniture companies often viewed furniture as a high-end, expensive product. But IKEA shattered this premium furniture frame and introduced a new frame, an affordable, flat pack furniture model where customers could assemble the product themselves. So a lot of companies are using this and making sure that they don't stay in those same frames because that's going to really hurt their the innovative strategy that they come up with and just their thinking on what to do next and how to differentiate their brand.
And this is something again that is it's a must-have skill, but it's also something that's playful in terms of developing this skill. So it can be a difficult thing when people start helping you to shift and shatter your frames, but it can also be very playful, especially if it's embedded within your culture.
I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.